Hello everyone, it's Jabbar here. Today's video is a patron request. If you'd like to make a video request of your own, you can do so by becoming a patron. A link to my Patreon can be found below. In episode 1 of this series, we discussed the warfare and strategies of the forest kingdoms of the West African Gold Coast, the most powerful of these kingdoms being the Ashanti, who eventually extend their influence north of the forests and well into the grasslands of West Africa. However, despite their military might, there were other kingdoms of this unfamiliar grassland region that made the Ashanti look rather small. North of the forest zone, West Africa gives way to a vast expanse of seasonal grasslands, and further north of that, these grasslands become somewhat of a transitional shoreline between the wetter lands to the south and the Great Sahara Desert to the north. This shoreline is also known as the Sahel, which comes from the Arabic word Sahel, quite literally translating to shoreline or coast, and is a root word shared by the name Swahili, which denotes the coastal peoples of East Africa, and a region spanning from the Horn of Africa to Tanzania. So anyway, back on track. As with other vast expanses of grasslands and steppes around the world, large empires were carved out by armies largely composed of cavalry and led by nomadic mounted archers and javelineers. Those of the West African Sahel were no different, and were synonymous to the Central Asian steppe people such as Turks, Huns, and Mongols, or the North American Sioux, Crow, or Blackfoot peoples. One notable difference with the empires of West Africa's grasslands, however, was that though there were some nomadic groups such as the Fula, the vast majority maintained relatively permanent and centralized kingdoms since ancient times, with evidence of permanent human settlements in the region dating back as far as 1500 BCE, a stark contrast to their largely nomadic and pastoral counterparts in the other arid grasslands of the world. This is attributed to the fact that Africa's Sahel had two things that the grasslands of Eurasia and North America lacked: large and fertile river systems such as the Niger, Gambia, and Senegal rivers, which facilitated intensive agriculture and thus large populations, as well as several local gold mines for trade with foreign peoples. Without these, the Sahelian regions would likely consist of nomads, hunters, and pastoralists, not unlike those of Central Eurasia or North America's Great Plains. This sharp contrast between deserts, grasslands, and forests in West Africa led to some radical differences in warfare from region to region, with forest kingdoms favoring infantry, desert peoples favoring cavalry, and grasslands and Sahel favoring a mixture of both, though armies predominantly composed of cavalry were not uncommon in grasslands. These vast river systems formerly mentioned could also host sizable navies, such as that of the Niumi Kingdom, which led not one, but several successful naval victories against the Portuguese slave-raiding ships along the Gambia in the mid-15th century, forcing the King of Portugal to establish formal and peaceful trade relations, which I discussed in much more detail in this video, if you'd like to check it out. Despite the relatively permanent status of most of West Africa's Sahelian kingdoms, nomads still played a major role in the history of the region, boasting a large influence over the politics, economy, and military power of the region. Usually nomadic desert or steppe armies would freely move in and out of wars for their own benefit. In some cases, kingdoms would attempt to utilize these nomadic wars to their advantage, and in many cases unsuccessfully. In 1722, the ruler of Morocco attempted to utilize nomadic troops to intervene with enemy lines during a battle. He should have known that this was unwise, as his predecessors attempted the same strategy, using desert nomads in their military campaign, who they referred to as Ormans, but quickly learned that desert nomads tended to follow their own course of the war. However, these attempts at utilizing nomads were not always unsuccessful. Many armies south of the Sahara would often and successfully utilize Orman armies for purposes of raiding rivaling kingdoms for cattle and slaves. Tuaregs and Bambaras were often utilized in this manner by various groups in order to increase their numbers on the battlefield. The nomadic parties joined the causes of their respective kingdoms with the incentive to plunder cities for their own benefit, while at the same time achieving the political objectives of the respective kingdoms that recruited them. In 1722, for example, a party of over 200 Ormans as well as 200 more Arabs were recruited by the ruler of Fudatoro to invade the small kingdom of Wallo all the way up to Kalam. They successfully made off with large quantities of slaves and cattle, despite heavy resistance from the army of Wallo. While these raids were not always successful, the fact that they were conducted by foreign nomads allowed the ruler of Futatoro to sabotage the kingdom of Wallo without any direct consequences to himself or his kingdom, as these raids were virtually anonymous forms of harassment. Though there are a few notable exceptions like the armies of Benin and Oyo, the warriors of the African Sahel were some of the few sub-Saharan African armies that were known to have worn armor extensively, ranging from quilted cotton, leather, chainmail, and even plate armor in some cases, such as the indigenous breastplates forged by the blacksmiths of the Kanem-Bornu Empire. In fact, in 1588, a warrior from the Songhai Empire was documented being saved when a thrown javelin was deflected by his helmet. Another notable demonstration of armor use was in 1553, when a large force of armored horsemen from the kingdom of Katsina overcame a Songhai raiding party and spared the lives of the Songhai warriors due to their bravery. Several surviving examples of the armor worn by these warriors in the other Hausa kingdoms can still be seen today. It also seems as though the practice of armor use was diffused westward from this region across the African Sahel. This seems most evident in the fact that by the middle of the 15th century, the Jollof appeared to have recently adopted the practice of wrapping their chests and abdomen with dense layers of cloth so that no weapon can pierce them. Melee weapons usually consisted of lances and curved blades similar to Arabic scimitars or Ethiopian shotels. These types of weapons have historically been ideal for mounted combat in all parts of the world. Mounted archers were also common, with the fulbe perhaps being the greatest example. Most cavalry, however, preferred javelins over archery and carried a quiver of 10 to 20 at any given time. In fact, 17th century writer Fernandez claimed that these warriors were so incredibly skilled in javelin throwing that they were capable of throwing them as fast as a musket ball. Though this was almost certainly an exaggeration, the comparison shows a true testament as to how formidable these javelineers were in battle. The skill and precision of these javelineers was so highly prized that many stories and legends were written about them. One example being Askia Musa brandishing his quiver of javelins to his enemy in 1529 and solemnly saying, "These are the sun, and you are the shade. When they suffer pain, they will rush to you, and then I will forgive them." Javelins are held in a similar regard to the swords of feudal Japan and Europe, being passed down as heirlooms. This isn't where the similarities end either. Just as Europeans and Japanese often engaged in single combat with swords, similar battles took place in the Sahel. However, this is where the similarities do end. These fights would take place from horseback with javelins. This required an incredible amount of skill and precision, throwing javelins from horseback at an enemy who's also mounted, with armor protecting both the horse and the rider. During the Songhai Civil War of 1588, two heroes engaged in single combat in this very same way. Kermina Fari faced off against Balma'a from the rebel army. Kermina Fari was ultimately victorious when he mortally wounded Balma'a with one devastating throw. The amount of skill required for this type of combat had to be practiced from a very early age in order to achieve this sort of proficiency. The horse was just as important to the javelineers as their weapons were. Horses from the kingdom of Jola, for example, were noted to be so well trained that they followed their owners around like dogs. Leaping on and off galloping horses, retrieving thrown lances and javelins from the ground whilst riding were other notable skills possessed by Jollof riders. These riders were even known to be able to erase hoof prints from horsebacks with their shields while riding, to conceal their tracks from enemies. The skill and professionalism within Sahelian militaries did not just rest on individual soldiers and their abilities either, but the entire army as a whole. In Sahelian kingdoms, or more specifically, the Songhai Empire, having a professional standing army had become the norm as early as the 15th century. This included a corps of full-time soldiers, raised and trained by Songhai ruler Askia Mohammed Toure, or as chronicler Al-Sadi put it, distinguished between the civilian and the army, unlike Sunni Ali when everyone was a soldier. Something that hadn't happened in Britain or United States until the 17th and 19th centuries respectively. Regional armies were also under the command of the Askia, usually commanded by his family members to ensure loyalty. However, this seems to have had an opposite effect as it led to perpetual competition for the throne and ultimately the downfall of Songhai. Incompetent Askias could quite easily be overthrown and conspired against, since his competitors were generals of their own large armies throughout the empire. Civil wars, coups, and counter-coups happened regularly throughout the empire's history. Askia Muhammad Toure was also known for having very cynical views towards traditional armies, and often to grave expense. One such example was in 1506 when his army suffered heavy casualties against Borgu. In response to this, Askia Muhammad's brother told him, "You have annihilated Songhai," which Muhammad replied that he had actually given life to Songhai, implying that Borgu would have eliminated all chance of peace within the empire had it been annexed. Despite the wisdom, intelligence, and professionalism possessed by Songhai's generals, nothing could prepare them for their demise. The Kingdom of Morocco had strong ambitions to control the salt trade, which they intended to take from Songhai, or what they called Sudan, or Land of the Blacks. Stay tuned for part 3 of African Warfare and Military Strategy, where we'll go over a detailed breakdown of the conflicts that arose between the two powers, from the middle of the 16th century well into the 17th. Thanks for watching, guys, and remember, if you'd like to make a Patreon request of your own, you can do so by supporting the channel at the link below, and always remember, we don't come from nothing.